Hello, and thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, and we'll explore the fascinating story of the City of Mississauga together. This week we're pleased to welcome John Dunlop, Manager of Heritage Planning and Indigenous Relations at the City of Mississauga, and we're going to explore some myths, misconceptions, and realities of designated heritage properties. So joining me again this week on Ask a Historian is John Dunlop. He is the Manager of Heritage Planning and Indigenous Relations with the City of Mississauga. And John has come back to discuss some of the myths and mysteries of heritage designation and its process and what it means and what it doesn't mean in the City of Mississauga. So thank you, John, once again for spending some time with us here.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Matthew.
Wonderful. I know you get all kinds of questions, whether they be from residents, whether they're from real estate agents, whether they're from developers or would-be purchasers of property. There's all kinds of kind of myths and stories around what designation actually means from a practical application perspective of what you can and cannot do with your property and the opportunities it provides and the like. And so I hear the questions. I know you do. I've seen a couple on literally on some of the Facebook feeds that I follow the last couple of weeks. Just, questions that people raise, and you kind of, us who work in the industry, you raise an eyebrow, go, no, that's not quite what that means. But I guess the impetus behind this is to focus on some of those common questions that we get and what it does and doesn't mean from a designation perspective. I mean, one of the maybe the hardest one to articulate is, why do we do it? What is the importance of heritage preservation? We've talked about this before, but in layman's terms, how it fits with the city identity and the pillars that the city has identified as being important for community. I wonder if you can briefly touch on that aspect of why it is that we look to conserve heritage.
Absolutely. I think the primary reason we look to conserve heritage is that it provides character to an area. And, that's not to say that a new build doesn't provide character. They absolutely do. But it's about, maintaining the character that's already there. One of the great things about having heritage properties is that they can be completely unique. In some cases, they might be a property that was almost experimental architecture, something that an architect tried on a single property but never replicated anywhere else. So you could have a completely unique home that's completely original to you. You will not have that anywhere else, not even in the city, but like just anywhere, period. The other thing is that it breaks up the city and provides that character, so you don't end up with one monotonous piece of sprawl. Mississauga has been poorly defined over the years as being an area of sprawl, and that's just not the case. Not only do we have our natural heritage areas and amazing park systems and so forth that run up and down our rivers and creeks and so forth, but we have these amazing neighborhoods that provide character and help break the city up and provide you with different places and different viewpoints, and it provides for the city that a tangible intangibleness, if you will, where you can go to some place like UTM, which is chock-a-block full of brutalist architecture. And sure, brutalist architecture isn't for everybody, but it's unique, it's different, and it speaks to a specific era. And it's always interesting to go back and look at that, even if you're going, what were they thinking when the architect designed this? Because it's one man's treasure is another man's trash. But generally, heritage is always seen as something that is interesting. It speaks to people in a way that can't necessarily be put into words, and it's like music and art and everything, as we've discussed, that it lends something to people, to the community, to the character of the city.
Oh, beautifully said. The reference we made, I think, a couple of weeks ago on the program, but Michael Spaziani, a heritage architect here in Mississauga, uses the term frozen music, and that interplay of space and place and how it makes it interesting in a livable city. I mean, we can read a lot about the different concepts of what makes a city livable and walkable and breathable and all those sorts of things. But heritage is an intrinsic value within in that, and I think it's just fascinating when you see the variety and you see the interplays of time. Really gives you a sense of place, I think, and so I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. Some of the bigger questions we have, I guess maybe the myths or the misnomers of heritage come a lot when there's a property transaction in place, and some things of what it means or doesn't mean for an owner. So if somebody has a designated home, whether they're looking to purchase or buy or renovate, or what it just means in everyday terms for someone working with a heritage property. Some of the misnomers, one of the things is heritage designation means I can't change anything. Can you tell us a little bit the process and kind of how we answer a question like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably the most common misconception when it comes to designated heritage properties. And when a property is designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, a bylaw is passed, and that bylaw will contain a list of what's called the heritage features of a specific property. And that can be well, anything and everything that gives heritage characteristics to that property. So it can be the overall shape and size of the house. It can be its architectural style. It could be the style of the windows and the doors, or of the chimney. And that, what's important on that is saying, so then we have these bylaws and we have these heritage characteristics. So if somebody needs to change something on their property, what we do is we review it against that list. And the goal is to say, we don't want to significantly alter those heritage features, and we don't want to significantly alter the property in a way that it's going to detract from that. So, that doesn't mean that you can't make changes. You absolutely can make changes. Heritage planning slogan is managing that change. And that's exactly what we do, is saying, so you want to make changes to a heritage property. First and foremost, we very, very, very rarely ever preserve anything on the inside of a house, especially if it's privately owned. Typically, we reserve that for the publicly owned buildings, because that's a responsibility that befalls on us as a city to manage the interior of these places. But if it's a private house, even if it's got some great features inside, we don't protect that, because we understand a house needs to be modernized to be lived in. So if you're dealing with a furnace that is oil, an oil furnace, you want to get rid of that. You want to modernize it. You want to put it to gas or electric or what have you. Absolutely, we want to, we don't want to stand in the way of that. A foundation that's cracking, we want to be able to assist people with repairing that. We don't ever want to make it a hindrance, because we want to keep a house livable. If they want to significantly alter a property in a way that isn't complementary, that's where we have to have the discussions and just sort of look to other options about how something can still be achieved. What's becoming very much happening is a lot of heritage houses can be on the smaller side, and people want to expand them because they want more space. Absolutely. Additions are a great way of doing that, and most of, or in fact, all of our heritage conservation districts have guidance specific to those additions. So you can put it on additions to your house. It's absolutely permissible. It's just where we want to see something, we want to make sure that a property isn't changed to such a degree that it's unrecognizable as heritage anymore.
So that's a good segue into another question that pops up occasionally, is that additions to heritage properties have to look old. And we see that a lot, and we've seen some excellent examples of additions within heritage conservation districts even. I just wonder if you can answer, speak to that one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually prefer that they not look old. That's the best practice on additions to a heritage property is one that is complementary but separate. It has to be clear that it is an addition. you know. So it can speak to a lot of the heritage elements of the property, and that's an ideal way of doing it, is to because it's very complementary. But we're not looking for someone to necessarily put a brick addition on exact matching brick on an existing heritage brick house, because we want to be able to, at the end of the day, we want somebody to be able to stand there and look at it and go, I can see where the original house is and I can see where they put an addition on, and it looks great together, but you can definitely tell there's separation. And in some cases you can get very modern, beautiful additions put on a heritage house. I personally, when it's done exquisitely well, and we have some great examples of that in the city, it looks fantastic because it really sets both pieces of the building apart but complementary in a way that it makes everything stand out, and it becomes a really beautiful property.
In a way, it can be used also to showcase the heritage element of the property as well.
Exactly. It's a way that you know, you can show off the heritage and show off a modern piece of architecture together, and it just looks fantastic.
There's a lot of questions that we receive on another kind of myth is around property values, of a negative impact on property values. And we've seen kind of arguments on the other side that it does the adverse, or at least has more of a stability on the property. But I'm sure you get this question a lot from a property value perspective. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of studies that have been done that talk specifically about heritage property values. To be honest, in the current real estate market that the better part of the GTA is in, there's very little that affects property value. And where the studies that have been done demonstrate is that when you end up in a place like a heritage conservation district, it actually over time dramatically increases the value of that property, because when you have controls on a specific neighborhood, you end up with a level of stability, which can inherently increase your property value. There are people, you know, that are interested in knowing that they can never live beside a very large house, and those are the people that want to purchase in a heritage neighborhood, because they know that it's going to be stable. They know that they're not going to have to face off against you know, a new higher intensity development. There's lots of places for intensity in the city. There's a lot, you know, we embrace that, we want to encourage that, but not at the cost of the heritage. And so we end up with heritage conservation districts, which, you know, don't allow for as much development to occur. Again, there's additions and so forth that get put on, but it's all quite minimal, and it helps retain a little bit of that you know, that heritage. And as I said, the key word is stability, and the real estate market loves stability, and you end up with year over year increases in property value in these districts.
And what about age-related things? You have, you know, we talked about criteria before and how heritage properties are evaluated and what's considered of importance from a legislative perspective, but there's a little bit of a misnomer that something has to be X number of years old before it can be designated. And I wonder if you can talk, I know we've dealt with criteria before, but just kind of the adjudication process of determining heritage, and how age isn't really a factor in that determination.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because yeah, typically there's this myth that's out there that it's, you know, nothing less than 100 years old is considered heritage, and that sort of comes from two places. One is just people's understanding of what is heritage. You know, heritage, people think means old, and so they assume that there's some kind of numerical threshold on that. And the other one is that there is guidance out there, but specific to bridges in Ontario, that any bridge that's over 40 years of age should be considered for heritage. And that's very specific to a very, very specific type of structure, that of bridges. It doesn't speak to heritage structures universally. So, you know, 100 years is sort of a very general guideline, but definitely if we have properties that are incredibly unique from an architecture standpoint, or have had a very prominent person living in them and they're maybe only 50 years old, it's something that we would consider anyways. There's no limit to when something's going to be considered heritage. It can be quite young, by all considerations. Those are rarer because, again, there's that attitude of what is heritage, but there's absolutely no age limit. It's not suddenly, if you bought a house that was built in 1921, as soon as the calendar turns, you're suddenly going to discover that the city's going to put you on the heritage registry because your house is 100 years old. It does not work like that.
And we've talked a little bit about in the past as well about our own evolving perceptions in the industry of what is heritage, and how we capture so we get away from the colonial mentality of how buildings connect to our heritage stories, and or how places connect to our heritage stories. So that ties into the age factor too, right, in terms of determination. And you know, I'll put you on the spot a little bit, and apologize for no warning, but the idea of kind of the industry's perceptions on determining value are evolving, and I'm wondering if you can touch on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Canada is an evolving country. All countries are evolving, but the diversity that's seen in Canada, and most specifically in Mississauga, speaks to one of the reasons why Mississauga is a great city. And that diversity means there isn't a one-size-fits-all heritage. Certainly the heritage industry, and definitely a lot of the regulation and so forth, has a bent towards that 19th century colonial settler heritage. There's no dispute on that. So the challenge then becomes, how do we address that, and allow for more diversity? And allow is not the right word. How do we accept the heritage of the diverse community that exists within Mississauga? Of saying, we're looking at communities that thrive in Mississauga, but they might have only been here for 40 or 50 or 60 years. What are the impacts that they've had? And a lot of heritage planning is focused on the built form. And so it's, the trend of what we're looking at now is, how do we expand that to consider, not every single community that's moved into Mississauga has had the ability to own land. A lot of it has been through rental space and so forth. So how are we going to recognize that? How are we going to commemorate it? And how are we going to ensure that when we work on heritage in the city, we work on everybody's heritage and not just focus on some parts of it? And that's a big challenge for heritage departments across Ontario, across Canada, is making sure that we're speaking to everyone's heritage.
And part of that process is also reaching out and making those connections and gathering those stories to better understand it as well.
That's it, exactly. I mean, it's easy to do colonial history because it's so well documented, and you can learn about, the Irish or Scottish or English immigrant that came on and purchased that crown patent, 200 odd years ago, and you could pretty much write a biography about that person, because the census records will fully detail who they were, who their kids were, what their occupation was. Almost sometimes it feels like almost down to their shoe size. You could give a police sketch of somebody that lived 200 years ago. The detail is there. But when you're working with communities that historically haven't been documented to the same degree, it becomes a lot more difficult. And there's a bias in the heritage industry to ignore what can't be found. And so we look to, research that's coming out all the time. Thankfully, universities are doing a ton of research on this in terms of including the diversity. There's been so much work done over the last few years. There's so much more work that needs to happen, but the Black history in Ontario is one that is getting better and better documented. And as that documentation is made, it's, we start to look to our properties, we look to our built forms, and we say, how does this impact it? I've read articles and studies that even demonstrate that preserving neoclassical architecture styles is inherently a biased thing, because there was a almost an unintended, or maybe very intended, racist bent on those neoclassical designs when they were being erected. And so, not to detract from that form of architecture, but we have to consider its impacts on everybody when we're preserving something. We don't want to, you know, it's like the discussion that was had around Dundas last year with Black Lives Matter. He was a slave owner. He fought against abolition and so forth. We don't want to misinterpret the celebration of somebody who does not have a notoriety history. We should still tell that story, but we don't want to celebrate it.
Yeah, you have to tell the story in its full context and its full understanding of what it means, and not just a part of it. And,
exactly.
So, coming back to kind of the myths around heritage designation, one of the misconceptions we hear quite a bit is that it means that an individual property owner will lose control of their property. Coming back to a person working on their own property, living in their own house, that sort of thing. And we hear that one a lot. And I always think that's one of the ones where it's like, okay, let's break this down as to what it means and what it certainly doesn't mean. Can you speak to that as one of the comments?
Absolutely. As I said, a designated property carries a bylaw on it, which sort of lists what can and cannot be changed on a property. And it's not that those elements can't be changed. There's a process that they have to go through. And that process is they have to explain what the change is going to be. They have to submit it in writing to the city. That gets reviewed by city staff and then on to the Heritage Advisory Committee. And, under the Ontario Heritage Act, council has final decision-making authority on alterations. But, to be honest, I can't think of a lot. I can't think of a case where council has ever denied somebody the ability to alter their property, so, and to be honest, the thought of losing control over a property, the requirements under heritage aren't that different from what's required under the Ontario Building Code, and so it's there are more considerations to it, but it's no different than if you wanted to build a deck or a shed that requires a building permit. You have to follow the same process. As a matter of fact, typically we don't know of, we're first alerted to changes happening on a heritage property when the owner comes in for a building permit. So it's actually the building permit that would trigger a review of the work happening on the property, yeah. As a result. So it's an add-on to the overall process of owning, the requirements that fall under owning a property. You don't lose any more control than you do normally under the building code process.
So part and parcel of that, just as an example, would be something like paint color. Someone says, well, designation means I can't change my paint color, and we know that's not the process. Can you just touch on that? I'm sure you've had questions like that.
Yeah, we get asked all the time about, oh, can I paint my house a certain color? And, we don't actually have an opinion on that. You can paint your house any color you want. The advice we tend to offer is make sure it's one that we're not going to hear about it from your neighbors. That it's going to be so bright that don't paint it something iridescent that it's going to be shiny or something and cause some sort of public safety issue. But if you want to have a beautiful, brightly colored, a lot of people think heritage is sort of the darker or more earth tone colors and so forth, and that's just not the case. You look back, Greek and Roman statues look plain today because all the paint's worn off, but when they were brand new, they were painted up in the brightest of colors, and that's always been the case. It's just that as something ages, it tends to lose its vibrancy in terms of its color. But if you want to paint your heritage house a beautiful, vibrant color, absolutely. There's very little that we could say, and so we don't ever have requirements on the color of paint for a house.
Well, just a story that'll make you chuckle a little bit just from a paint color perspective. I grew up in Arundel Village, which today is a cultural landscape in the city of Mississauga, certainly a heritage feel to the village. And for a very short period of time, the house beside mine that I grew up on, that I grew up in, was painted pink. We referred to it as the Pepto Bismol house, and it lasted for about a month, and then the owner changed it themselves. it was one of those things where I'm pretty sure they didn't plan to paint it twice, but the first turn was a light pink with a dark pink trim. And I kid you not, top to bottom 2-story pink house, and it did not live for very long in that color. But sometimes you shake your head.
Well, and that's it, you know, I mean, but then you end up with places like, you know, the housing and the heritage housing in St. John's, Newfoundland, that's famous for its vibrant colors. And it's, you know, that something like that would be, you know, it's absolutely appropriate.
Yeah. And in a way, you see that has its own intrinsic cultural value as well, in terms of just the vibrancy that community has embraced throughout its timeline in terms of the colors, and you see pictures of Newfoundland, just for an example, and you expect it. Like,
exactly.
If there was a white house with black trim, I'm sure it might stand out in the opposite. So just, you know, some of the other ones we get, maybe one of the bigger topics is the way in which perhaps there's an interest in heritage that comes about when it's in time for a subdivision or development, using kind of heritage designation to block development or stand in its way. And we know that's not something that is intrinsic to the values that we profess with heritage. But if you can touch on that, because I'm sure you've seen questions come up around heritage in relationship to development.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really big myth, is that there's this sense that if a property were designated, it couldn't be developed. And that's simply not the case. That's not how the legislation is set up. That's not how the entire process is set up. As I said before, you know, we exist to manage change in the city. And so that entire concept is that it is permissible to have change. And that can affect heritage properties as well. So what we do, though, is when a property does come up for development and there are heritage buildings, or the property is a heritage property, it's about how are you going to incorporate that development into the existing heritage, you know. And that's the discussion then lends towards, well, the heritage is already there. And you want to put something new in. So in a lot of ways, we treat it like an addition. And as we've already touched on, how are you incorporating that addition so that it celebrates the heritage that's already on the property, and not trying to hide it or disguise it, or, you know, just get rid of it so that a developer could put an entire subdivision in. So it's about striking that balance of saying, acknowledging what's already been there, but allowing the new to come in. The city, any city, it's constantly growing, it's constantly evolving, and you know, we don't exist to stop it. We exist to say, this is important. If it was designated, it was designated for a reason. It was seen valuable by, you know, not just city staff, not just the Heritage Advisory Committee, but council, who makes these decisions on behalf of the city, but also because it had support from residents. If we didn't have support from the residents of the city to move forward with designating properties, it simply wouldn't happen, because we wouldn't have that support. That's what's critical to having a good, healthy heritage system, is that feedback and support from the residents that want to see it happen.
Right. A question, or a post that I saw just a few days ago, actually, was kind of a misnomer that comes out that when we see a lot of conversion of property, of adaptive reuse within our city. So you see a building that perhaps was not commercial, has become commercial, or even a commercial building that has a very long timeline within our city, has been around for multiple uses, multiple generations and such. There's this misnomer, or at least I've seen it posted, that a building loses its heritage status when it becomes commercial.
Yeah, that's simply not true. I mean, it changes its use. I suppose in an ideal way, you'd always want a house to be a house, but the reality is that's not always the future for that property. And you get a lot of heritage houses that become over time commercial properties. They remain heritage just because they've changed a use. It doesn't detract from the reason that they were designated. And so typically we're not concerned about what the use of a building is. It's more that the building is lived in, and lived in doesn't necessarily mean this is my home, this is where I live, but it means that it's continually in use. You know, so if it's somebody's office space, and they come into it every day and they take pride in it and they want to see it, you know, maintained in good measure and good form and so forth, it's you know, it really, it doesn't detract from the heritage in any way, shape, or form. There are gorgeous, celebrated heritage commercial properties that are out there that you know, they get seen more because there are commercial properties, and they get appreciated more. You know, there's houses, I think of, you know, prominent houses on Dundas Street in Arundel that are pretty much all commercial, but they're still designated as heritage properties, and they also celebrate that fact in their business as well, as and take pride in owning a heritage property.
And we just saw in February, Heritage Planning, Heritage Mississauga and the museums did a How Do Heritage Week on for Heritage Week on heritage buildings that are restaurants. And again, they celebrate the history of their location as part of the charm that draws their audience in.
And they're all former residential properties that have been converted to a restaurant over time. Again, a great use, and it adds, I mean, a restaurant, most restaurants benefit from a building that has some character, and heritage buildings all have character. So, you know, moving into a heritage property means that you've already got that intrinsic heritage built into your business, and then you know, it's a great way to celebrate that building as it continues to age and mature.
Yeah, the whole idea about creating functional spaces, right, and keeping them functional within the community that's evolving around them. You know, like you said, you don't exist to stop change. You help to manage the process and can serve as you can as that process evolves. Speaking of conservation and kind of the support systems, we do know there's some truth to it that a heritage building can be more expensive to upkeep when it comes to major renovation challenges or major upkeep, structural foundation, you know, that kind of thing. Buildings age. I mean, that's a natural process, and so repairs have to be made over time. But there's a process that the city has in place to help offset the costs for those caring for designated heritage buildings. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the heritage property grant process.
Yeah, absolutely. So the city runs a heritage properties grant program annually. If we aren't maxed out on applications in the first round, and the first round happens right now, it actually closes at the end of this month. So if you own a heritage property, I'd invite you to just do a quick online search. You can go to the City of Mississauga Heritage Planning page, and there's a link to the grants portal directly there. And it talks about the city will provide matching funds for maintenance projects on a heritage property, depending on the type of project that's being undertaken. Some are conservation, some are more dealing more, you know, like with foundations and so forth that help keep the building standing. You know, but there's several tiers of the grant program, and we're very eager to max out that program every year. We want to see it because, again, we do understand that, as you said, sometimes a heritage property, you know, it's going to cost more. If you have a Credit Valley stone foundation, you want to have that foundation repaired properly, and that can be cost effective. You can also end up in a heritage property that has undergone a lot of change over the years, and maybe all that change wasn't necessarily up to code because it happened 40, 50, 60 years ago by you know, a previous owner who was a do-it-yourselfer, and it was a good enough patch job for the time that they were living in it, but it's, you know, that type of thing happens, and we want to be there to support our residents and make sure that when they do face you know, maintenance costs related to their heritage property, that we're there to support them.
No, absolutely, and the idea that there is that I don't know if the right word is a carrot, but there is a an understanding that there's a common good that comes out of heritage, and that the municipality can share some of that burden for designated properties and to keep them functioning in our city. And I think that, I mean, that's I've been involved when that process was a thought and seen it evolve into an actual grant, and then seen the grant increase. And so it's phenomenal that we're able to do that. You know, as a maybe rewards the wrong thing, but a thank you and an assistance for those caring for heritage properties. And I know you get a lot of questions about that process too, in terms of how do we upkeep heritage properties, and you know, what's the best practices. And I think maybe that's the key thing is if you have a heritage property and you're undertaking repairs, if you're looking to do something, find out what the best practices are. Find out what the best uses of material are. Mortar is not universal over time, and you know, like window glass is not always one size fits all in historic buildings, and the like. And so there's all these kinds of challenges that you mentioned earlier on about how they make a property unique, and you know, one of a kind. And we might have the you know, the Ontario vernacular farmhouse, so you know, the story and a half Gothic revival farmhouse you see all over the province. But is there a single one that is the exact same as another? You know, like that's the nature of changes. Is quite helps make the space of what we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And to that point, you know, the city also this year has expanded its Urban Design Awards program to include heritage properties, and have and you know, and so that's also an award that's ongoing. And if you have a heritage property that speaks to you as a landmark and as a place that helps make the character, you know, I encourage applications to come in, because the applications are open and ongoing. And you know, it adds to the character of the city, and it's something that should be celebrated.
Absolutely. And you look at places like, you know, within our city, the downtown core, commercial core of Streetsville is quite unique. But you look at things where, you know, the modern use of a community can be tied in quite strongly to its heritage, in terms of marketing, in terms of business development plans. You know, it's not like you said, it's not about a resting time. I think that's probably the biggest misconception to put away with. It's about managing that change, but celebrating the history of a community as part of its identity. Yeah. So, you know, with that, John, I thank you once again. Your delight to pick your brain and to share your knowledge and your wisdom here. And you know, I thank you for the guidance that you provide to our heritage conservation process. But again, that steady hand at the management of change, and being able to embrace the story of over time of our community through its places and its spaces. It really does reinforce those pillars of community identity that are outlined in the official plan for the City of Mississauga.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew. It's always a pleasure. As I love to say, you know, Mississauga's heritage stretches back really 13,000 years. It stretches back to time immemorial. It was a great place to live then. It was a great place to live 5,000 years ago. It was a great place to live 500 years ago. And it's a great place to live. People always keep coming. And that's actually why there's so much heritage here, is because people keep coming and creating that heritage in the city. So it's never a hardship for me to come and celebrate that and talk about it and enjoy it. And I hope everybody does and gets a chance to.
Wonderful, wonderful. What a great way to wrap up this week's program. So again, thank you, John, and appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian. A special thank you to John Dunlop for exploring some of the myths and possibilities of owning heritage-designated properties in the City of Mississauga. And each week, we look forward to exploring the fascinating story and history of the City of Mississauga with you. So please, send in your questions, and we'll keep turning over the stones of the past as we explore the story of this place.